The fateful meeting. Jake Morrison wiped the grease from his hands with a worn cloth, the familiar hum of the ship's engines providing a comforting backdrop to his work. The research vessel New Horizon had been his home for 3 years now, and he knew every bolt, wire, and circuit like the back of his calloused hands. At 28, Jake had already earned a reputation as one of the best mechanics in the fleet, despite his tendency to work in oil-stained coveralls and speak his mind without much filter. The engine room was Jake's sanctuary, a place where problems had logical solutions and honest work earned honest results. He preferred the company of machines to the stuffiness of diplomatic meetings or the endless protocols that governed life aboard a research vessel. His colleagues often joked that he spoke to the engines more than he spoke to them, and Jake didn't mind that reputation one bit. That morning started like any other. Jake was elbow-deep in a stubborn cooling system when the ship's alert klaxons suddenly blared to life, their urgent wailing echoing through the metal corridors. Red lights flashed in rhythm with the sound, casting eerie shadows across the engine room walls. Jake straightened up quickly, hitting his head on a low-hanging pipe in the process. "Attention all crew members," Captain Sarah Chen's voice crackled through the intercom system. "This is not a drill. We have contact with an unidentified alien vessel. All personnel report to designated stations immediately. Diplomatic Protocol Omega is now in effect." Jake's wrench clattered to the floor as the significance of the announcement hit him. First contact. After decades of scanning the stars and hoping for signs of intelligent life, humanity was finally meeting another species. The New Horizon, originally designed as a deep space research vessel, had been hastily retrofitted with diplomatic facilities when long-range sensors detected the approaching alien ship. The corridors buzzed with activity as crew members rushed to their positions. Scientists clutched data tablets and recording devices, their faces mixing excitement with barely controlled terror. Security personnel checked their equipment with practiced efficiency, while diplomatic staff smoothed their formal uniforms and reviewed protocol handbooks they'd probably memorized weeks ago. Jake found himself caught in the middle of the chaos, still wearing his grease-stained coveralls and looking decidedly unprofessional compared to everyone around him. He started toward his quarters to change, but Captain Chen's voice boomed over the intercom again. "All essential personnel to observation deck. This includes engineering staff. We need full systems monitoring during the encounter." Essential personnel. Jake had never thought of himself that way, but apparently keeping the ship running during humanity's first alien contact qualified as essential. He grabbed his diagnostic tablet and headed for the observation deck, figuring he could monitor the engines remotely while history unfolded around him. The observation deck had been transformed into something resembling a diplomatic reception hall. Temporary screens displayed real-time data about the approaching vessel, while carefully arranged seating provided clear views of the main viewport. The alien ship appeared as a graceful crystalline structure that seemed to bend light around itself, creating rainbow patterns that shifted and danced as it moved through space. Jake positioned himself near the engineering monitors, trying to stay out of the way while keeping an eye on the ship's vital systems. His coveralls felt increasingly inappropriate as he watched diplomats and scientists take their positions in pressed uniforms and formal attire. Captain Chen stood at the center of it all, her composure remarkable considering the magnitude of what was about to happen. "They're requesting permission to board," reported Communications Officer Rodriguez, her voice tight with concentration. "Their message is in perfect English, Captain. They've been monitoring our transmissions." The implications of that statement sent whispers through the assembled crew. These aliens had been watching humanity, learning their language, possibly studying their culture for who knew how long. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. "Permission granted," Captain Chen replied. "All departments report ready status." Jake watched his monitors as the alien vessel extended what appeared to be a docking tube toward the New Horizon. The technology was unlike anything in human databases, seeming to float like liquid metal before solidifying into a perfect seal with their airlock. His engineering instincts kicked in as he recorded every detail of the process, wondering how their technology achieved such precise control over matter. The airlock cycled, and humanity held its breath. The first alien to step aboard the New Horizon was tall and imposing, wearing what appeared to be military dress uniform made from materials that shifted color like oil on water. His features were angular and sharp, with skin that had a subtle metallic sheen, but it was the second figure that made Jake's breath catch in his throat. She moved with a grace that seemed to defy gravity, her form elegant and ethereal. Her skin had a soft luminescence that reminded Jake of moonlight on water, and her eyes held depths that suggested intelligence far beyond human comprehension. She wore robes that seemed to be woven from starlight itself, flowing around her in patterns that hypnotized anyone who looked too long. Princess Zaravel of the crystalline empire of Vethara had arrived, though Jake didn't know her title or name at that moment. All he knew was that he was looking at the most beautiful being he had ever seen, alien or otherwise. The military figure, Commander Thexnol, spoke first in a voice that resonated with harmonics no human throat could produce. The translation device rendered his words in crisp, formal English. "Greetings, humans of the vessel New Horizon. I am Commander Thexnol of the Imperial Fleet. I present to you Her Royal Highness, Princess Zaravel, daughter of the Crystal Throne, heir to the Eternal Light, and ambassador of the Vethari people." Captain Chen stepped forward, her diplomatic training evident in every gesture. "Your Highness, Commander, welcome aboard the New Horizon. I am Captain Sarah Chen, and on behalf of humanity, I extend our gratitude for this historic meeting." The princess inclined her head gracefully, and when she spoke, her voice was like music made audible. "The honor is ours, Captain Chen. We have observed your species with great interest and look forward to this cultural exchange." Jake found himself mesmerized by the sound of her voice and the way she carried herself with such natural dignity. He had always been more comfortable with machines than people, but something about this alien princess drew his attention like gravity. Maybe it was her obvious intelligence, or the way she seemed to take in every detail of her surroundings with genuine curiosity. The formal introductions continued, with various department heads being presented to the alien dignitaries. Jake tried to focus on his monitoring duties, but his eyes kept drifting back to the princess. She was examining the human technology with obvious fascination, asking questions that demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of engineering principles. That's when disaster struck. Captain Chen was in the middle of explaining the ship's research mission when Princess Zaravel noticed the engineering station where Jake was working. Her luminous eyes fixed on his diagnostic displays, clearly interested in the human technology they represented. "Fascinating," she said, moving closer to Jake's position. "Your power distribution systems are quite elegant in their simplicity." Jake looked up from his tablet to find the alien princess standing directly in front of him, those incredible eyes studying his equipment with genuine interest. For a moment, his mind went completely blank. Here was this amazing being, clearly intelligent and beautiful, showing interest in his work. Every protocol and diplomatic consideration flew out of his head. "Hello, cutie," Jake said with his characteristic easy smile, speaking in the same casual tone he might use with a colleague who had stopped by his workshop. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Princess Zaravel's luminescent skin suddenly blazed with colors Jake hadn't seen before. Brilliant purples and golds rippled across her features like aurora in fast forward. Her eyes widened in what could only be described as shock, and she took a step backward, nearly colliding with Commander Thexnol. The commander's expression shifted from diplomatic courtesy to something approaching murderous rage. His hand moved toward what was obviously a weapon, while several other members of the alien delegation began making sounds that the translation device couldn't properly render. Captain Chen's face went through several shades of pale as she realized what had just happened. The entire observation deck fell silent except for the humming of ship systems and Jake's suddenly very loud heartbeat. I apologize," Captain Chen began, but Princess Zaravel held up a hand that was still glowing with those incredible colors. "What did he call me?" the princess asked, her voice carrying harmonics that made the translation device stutter. The human used a term of endearment, Commander Thex Null said, his own voice resonating with barely controlled anger. In their culture, it appears to be a casual form of address, though highly inappropriate for endearment. The princess's colors shifted again, this time to softer hues that reminded Jake of sunset. He was being friendly. Jake realized that everyone on the observation deck was staring at him, including several security officers who looked ready to tackle him if he made any sudden movements. Captain Chen's expression suggested she was already composing his transfer papers, possibly to a posting on the outer rim of nowhere. "I meant no disrespect, Your Highness," Jake managed to say, his usual confidence replaced by growing mortification. "I was just being friendly. That's how humans talk to each other when we're being casual." The princess tilted her head in a gesture that was surprisingly human-like, despite her alien features. The colors in her skin continued to shift and dance, creating patterns that were beautiful but completely unreadable to human eyes. "Casual," she repeated, as if testing the word. "Your species uses terms of endearment casually." Captain Chen stepped forward, clearly hoping to salvage the situation. "Your Highness, please understand that Mechanic Morrison meant no offense. Human social customs can be quite informal, and—" "Mechanic Morrison," the princess said, and Jake was surprised to hear his name in her musical voice. "You maintain the ship's systems." "Yes, Your Highness," Jake replied, wondering if this was the part where he got spaced for insulting alien royalty. "I keep the engines running and the systems operational." "And you called me, what was the term?" "Cutie, because you were being friendly." The colors in her skin were shifting to even softer hues now, and Jake noticed that she was no longer backing away from him. If anything, she seemed to be leaning slightly forward, as if she were curious about his response. "Well, yes," Jake said, his honesty getting the better of his survival instincts. "You seemed interested in the engineering displays, and you're obviously intelligent. And, well, beautiful. It just seemed like a natural thing to say." Commander Thex Null made a sound that the translator rendered as something between a growl and a sigh. Several human crew members looked like they wanted to disappear into the deck plating, but Princess Zaravel's reaction was entirely unexpected. She laughed. It wasn't the formal, diplomatic laughter that might be expected in such a situation. It was genuine, delighted laughter that filled the observation deck with harmonics that made everyone's ears tingle. The colors in her skin exploded into brilliant patterns that reminded Jake of fireworks, and her eyes seemed to actually sparkle. "Beautiful," she repeated, still laughing. "You think I'm beautiful?" Jake found himself grinning despite the diplomatic disaster he had apparently created. "Your Highness, I think you're the most beautiful being I've ever seen, human or otherwise." The princess's laughter intensified, and her skin began displaying colors so brilliant that several crew members had to shield their eyes. Commander Thex Null looked like he was seriously considering whether diplomatic immunity would protect him from committing homicide aboard a human vessel. "This is most irregular," the commander said, his translation carrying undertones of deep disapproval. "Your Highness, perhaps we should return to formal protocols." "Nonsense," Princess Zaravel said, waving dismissively at her military escort. "This human finds me beautiful and calls me endearing names. I find this refreshing after cycles of diplomatic formality." She turned back to Jake, and he was surprised to see that her expression had softened considerably. The intimidating royal bearing was still there, but underneath it was something that looked almost like curiosity mixed with, was that shyness? "Tell me about your work, Mechanic Morrison," she said. "These power distribution systems you monitor. How do they function?" Jake blinked in surprise. After causing what was probably the biggest diplomatic incident in human history, the alien princess wanted to talk about engineering. He glanced at Captain Chen, who gave him a look that clearly said, "Don't make this worse," then back at the princess. "Well, Your Highness, It's actually pretty straightforward once you understand the basic principles. And so began the most unlikely technical discussion in the history of human-alien relations, with Jake explaining fusion reactor principles to an alien princess who had just been complimented by a grease-stained mechanic, while diplomats from two species tried to figure out whether this was a disaster or a breakthrough. As Jake talked about energy coupling and plasma containment, he noticed that Princess Zaravel's skin continued to display those soft, warm colors, and her attention never wavered from his explanations. For the first time since the aliens had boarded, he began to think that maybe, just maybe, his impulsive greeting hadn't been the end of the world after all. Little did he know that this was just the beginning of a connection that would change everything both species thought they knew about friendship. Growing connection and resolution. The next few days aboard the New Horizon passed in a blur of cultural exchanges, technical demonstrations, and carefully monitored interactions between human and Vetheri crew members. What had started as a potential diplomatic disaster had somehow evolved into an unprecedented opportunity for both species to learn from each other. Jake found himself at the center of this cultural exchange, much to his surprise and the continued consternation of Commander Thex Null. Princess Zaravel had specifically requested that he be assigned to work with her on a joint technical project, something about adapting human engineering principles to Vetheri technology. Captain Chen had agreed, though Jake suspected she was still trying to figure out whether this was brilliant diplomacy or career suicide. The princess had been given a workspace in one of the New Horizons science labs, and Jake arrived there on the third morning to find her already examining a collection of human tools and components with obvious fascination. Her skin was displaying those soft, warm colors he was beginning to associate with her good moods, and she looked up with what he was learning to recognize as a smile when he entered. "Good morning, Mechanic Morrison," she said, her musical voice making even his mundane title sound elegant. "Good morning, Your Highness," Jake replied, then grinned. "Though if we're going to be working together, you could just call me Jake." Mechanic Morrison sounds pretty formal for someone who calls people cutie. The princess's skin immediately shifted to those brilliant aurora colors, and Jake realized that she was blushing again. The effect was even more pronounced than it had been during their first meeting, with waves of color rippling across her luminescent features. "Jake," she repeated carefully, as if testing how the name felt. "And you may call me Zara, if you wish. When we are working together, there is no need for such formality." "Zara," Jake said, surprised by how natural it sounded. "I like it. It suits you better than all those titles." The blushing intensified, and Jake wondered if he would ever get used to how expressive Vetheri skin could be. It was like having a conversation with someone whose emotions were written in living light across their features. "You are very direct," Zara observed, though she didn't sound displeased. "Is this typical of your species?" "Pretty typical of me," Jake admitted. "I've never been much good at beating around the bush. My mom always said I was born without a filter between my brain and my mouth." "Filter." Zara tilted her head in that endearing gesture he was beginning to recognize. "Ah, you mean you speak your thoughts without excessive consideration of social protocols. That's a fancy way of putting it, but yeah." Zara was quiet for a moment, her skin cycling through subtle shades that Jake couldn't interpret. When she spoke again, her voice was softer than usual. "I find it refreshing. In the Crystal Court, every word is measured, every gesture calculated. Sometimes I wonder if anyone ever says what they truly mean." Jake looked at her with new understanding. Behind all the royal bearing and formal protocols was someone who was just as human as anyone else, despite being from an entirely different species. The loneliness in her voice was something he recognized, having felt it himself during long shifts in the engine room. "Well, around me you don't have to worry about that," Jake said. "I'll always tell you exactly what I think. Fair warning, though, it's not always tactful." Zara's laugh was becoming familiar now, and Jake decided it was one of his favorite sounds in the universe. "I think I would like that very much," she said. They spent the morning working on the joint project, which involved trying to integrate human diagnostic systems with Vetheri crystal technology. Jake was amazed by how intuitive Zora was with mechanical concepts, even though her people's technology was based on principles that seemed like magic to human eyes. "Your crystals respond to thought patterns?" Jake asked, watching as Zora made a piece of Vetheri tech glow simply by touching it. "Not thoughts exactly," Zora explained, her skin displaying the soft blues and greens that Jake was learning indicated concentration. "More like intentions, emotional resonance. Your language lacks the proper concepts." "Show me," Jake said, reaching out to touch the crystal himself. "It will not work for you," Zora said. "Humans do not have the proper neural." She stopped mid-sentence as the crystal suddenly blazed with light under Jake's touch, far brighter than it had been for her. "That should not be possible," she breathed, staring at the glowing crystal. Jake lifted his hand, and the light faded immediately. "Maybe humans are more adaptable than you thought. Or perhaps," Zora said slowly, "the crystals respond to something more universal than we believed." They spent the next hour experimenting with different combinations of human and Vetheri technology, discovering compatibility where none should have existed. Jake's natural mechanical intuition seemed to complement Zora's understanding of crystal resonance, creating hybrid solutions that impressed even the watching scientists. But it wasn't just the technical work that was bringing them together. As they worked, they talked about their lives, their worlds, their dreams and frustrations. Jake learned that Zora had always been fascinated by engineering and technology, but royal protocol had prevented her from pursuing such inappropriate interests. Zora learned that Jake had grown up poor, but had never let that stop him from reaching for the stars. "You chose your path," Zora said during one of their breaks, her voice carrying a note of envy. "Among my people, one's birth determines one's destiny." "That's not entirely true," Jake replied. "I mean, yeah, I chose to become a mechanic, but I didn't choose to be born human or male or on Earth. We all work with what we're given." "But you make it sound so simple." "Maybe because it is simple. Not easy, but simple. You figure out what makes you happy, and then you find a way to do more of that." Zora's skin shifted to thoughtful purples and golds. "And what makes you happy, Jake?" "Fixing things that are broken," Jake said without hesitation. "Making systems work better than they did before. Solving problems that other people say can't be solved." He paused, looking at her directly. "And lately, making you laugh." The aurora colors were back, painting Zora's features in brilliant light. "You succeed at that quite frequently." Their work was interrupted by the arrival of Commander Thexnol, whose expression suggested he had been sucking on something sour. Behind him came several other Vetheri officials that Jake didn't recognize, all wearing the kind of formal robes that suggested important positions and conservative attitudes. "Your Highness," the commander said, his tone carefully neutral but somehow conveying disapproval. "The High Council requests your immediate attention." Zora's skin immediately shifted to darker, more muted colors. "Of course, Commander." "Jake, we will continue this later." But Jake could see the tension in her posture, the way her luminescence dimmed as if someone had turned down her internal lights. Whatever this meeting was about, she wasn't looking forward to it. After Zora left with the Vetheri delegation, Jake tried to focus on his regular duties, but found his mind wandering back to their conversation. There had been something in her voice when she talked about her predetermined destiny, a sadness that resonated with his own occasional feelings of being trapped by circumstances beyond his control. It was Captain Chen who eventually filled him in on what was happening. "The conservative faction among the Vetheri is concerned about the princess's informal behavior," she explained during a private meeting in her quarters. "Apparently, some of them see her interaction with you as a threat to traditional protocols." "What kind of threat?" Jake asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "The kind where they want to end the cultural exchange and return to formal diplomatic channels only. No more joint projects, no more casual interactions. They're worried that the princess is becoming too influenced by human customs. Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach. And what does Zara think about this? Captain Chen gave him a sharp look. It's Princess Zara Vell Morrison, and I suspect she's caught between her personal preferences and her duty to her people. So what happens now? That depends largely on whether the princess can convince her people that this cultural exchange is beneficial, or whether the conservatives succeed in shutting it down. Jake left the captain's quarters with a growing sense of urgency. He had never been particularly political, but the thought of Zara being forced back into the rigid protocols that clearly made her unhappy stirred something protective in him. He found her in the observation lounge that evening, staring out at the stars through the main viewport. Her skin was displaying muted grays and blues, colors he had learned indicated sadness or deep thought. She looked up when he approached, and he was struck by how different she seemed from the vibrant, curious being he had been working with. "The meeting did not go well," she said without preamble. "Want to talk about it?" Jake asked, settling into the chair beside her. "They believe I am becoming too human," Zara said, the word carrying a weight of disapproval. "They say I am forgetting my duty to maintain proper dignity and distance." "And what do you think?" Zara was quiet for a long moment, her skin shifting through subtle patterns that Jake was beginning to read like facial expressions. "I think I have learned more about myself in these past few days than in all my previous cycles at court," she finally said. "I think your species has something mine has forgotten." "Which is?" "Joy," she said simply. "The simple pleasure of genuine connection with another being. At court, every interaction is calculated, every emotion carefully controlled. But with you," her skin began to brighten slightly, "with you, I can simply be myself." Jake felt something warm and protective stir in his chest. "Then don't let them take that away from you." "It is not so simple, Jake. I have responsibilities to my people, obligations that I cannot simply abandon." "Who says you have to abandon them?" Jake leaned forward, his engineer's mind already working on the problem. "You're a princess, right? That means you have influence, power. Use it. To what end? To show them that being yourself doesn't mean abandoning your responsibilities. Show them that humans and Vetheri can work together, that our differences make us stronger, not weaker." Zara looked at him with those incredible eyes, and Jake could see something shifting in her expression. "The joint project," she said slowly. "Our hybrid technology solutions. They work better than either species could achieve alone." "Exactly. We're proof that different approaches can complement each other instead of competing." But the conservatives will not be easily convinced. They see change as a threat to tradition. "Then we give them something they can't argue with," Jake said, his excitement growing as the plan formed in his mind. "We show them results that are so obviously beneficial that even the most conservative mind has to admit they're worthwhile." Zara's skin began to display those warm, hopeful colors again. "What do you have in mind?" Jake grinned, feeling more like himself than he had since the whole diplomatic crisis began. "We're going to build something that will knock their socks off." "Assuming Vetheri wear socks." "We do not wear socks," Zara said, laughing for the first time since their meeting had been interrupted. "But I understand the sentiment." Over the next 2 days, Jake and Zara worked with an intensity that surprised even their colleagues. They barely slept, taking meals in the lab while they refined their hybrid technologies. The breakthrough came when they successfully created a communication device that could translate not just language, but emotional intent, using a combination of human electronics and Vetheri crystal resonance. "It reads the emotional undertones in speech," Jake explained to the assembled representatives from both species. "Not just what someone says, but what they mean when they say it." The demonstration was remarkable. Human and Vetheri delegates used the device to have conversations that went beyond mere words, sharing concepts and feelings that had been impossible to communicate before. The conservative Vetheri faction watched in obvious amazement as barriers that had seemed insurmountable simply dissolved. "This technology," said one of the senior Vetheri officials, It could revolutionize diplomatic relations throughout the galaxy. It could, Zara agreed, her skin glowing with confident colors. But it only exists because we were willing to combine our different approaches, to learn from each other instead of maintaining rigid separation. Commander Thex Knoll, who had been skeptical throughout the entire process, stepped forward to examine the device more closely. Your Highness, this is extraordinary. How quickly could such devices be produced? That depends, Zara said, looking directly at the conservative faction, on whether we continue to allow collaboration between our species or return to formal protocols that prevent such innovation. Jake watched as the political implications played out across the faces of both human and Vetheri representatives. The device they had created wasn't just a technological breakthrough. It was proof that cooperation could achieve things that isolation never could. The debate that followed was intense but brief. Faced with tangible evidence of the benefits of cultural exchange, even the most conservative voices found it difficult to argue for a return to rigid separation. Very well, announced the senior Vetheri official. The cultural exchange program will continue with expanded cooperation in technological development. The celebration that followed was unlike anything Jake had ever experienced. Humans and Vetheri mingled freely, using the new translation devices to share jokes, stories, and ideas that bridged the gap between species. Jake found himself at the center of it all, still wearing his oil-stained coveralls, but no longer feeling out of place. You did it, Captain Chen said, approaching him with something that might have been pride in her expression. You turned a diplomatic disaster into a breakthrough. We did it, Jake corrected, looking across the room to where Zara was demonstrating the emotional translation device to a group of fascinated diplomats. All of us together. Later that evening, after the formal celebrations had ended, Jake found Zora back in their shared workspace. She was sitting quietly among the tools and crystal components they had used to build their revolutionary device, her skin displaying the soft, contented colors he associated with her happiness. Regrets? Jake asked, settling down beside her. None whatsoever, Zara replied firmly. For the first time in my life, I feel like I am exactly where I am supposed to be, doing exactly what I am meant to do. Even if it means dealing with a grease-stained human who calls you cutie. Zara's laughter filled the workspace with harmonics that made Jake's heart feel light. Especially because of that. Jake looked at this remarkable being who had somehow become his friend, partner, and collaborator, despite coming from a world he couldn't even imagine. Their friendship had started with an impulsive greeting that could have ended in disaster, but had instead opened doors neither species had known existed. So what happens now? Jake asked. Now, Zara said, her skin beginning to display those brilliant aurora colors that meant she was excited about something. We continue building bridges. Between our species, between our technologies, between our ways of thinking. Together. Together, she confirmed, and Jake thought that might be the most beautiful word in any language. As they sat surrounded by the fruits of their collaboration, Jake reflected on how a simple "hello, cutie" had changed everything. It had taught both species that sometimes the most profound connections come not from careful protocols and diplomatic formalities, but from one being simply treating another with genuine warmth and appreciation. The universe, Jake realized, was full of possibilities when you were brave enough to be yourself and kind enough to see the beauty in others, no matter how different they might seem. And if that wasn't worth celebrating, he didn't know what was. Outside the viewport, stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, but inside the new horizon, two species had found a new way to reach across the void and touch each other's hearts. It had started with embarrassment and laughter, and had grown into something that would change the galaxy forever. Not bad for a day's work, Jake thought, and beside him, Princess Zara Vel of the crystalline empire of Vetheri continued to glow with the warm light of friendship and infinite